pretty bad. In sort of something more like Blue Sky or whatever, or the other one. You have your own keys, but again, if you lose your keys, you lose your identity. Now, I personally have been working on various methods of having people own keys in ways that are not as catastrophic. I won't go into them right now because this is about this article. But yeah, so that's the first thing. The other thing, and this is supposed to sort of differentiating sort of protocols that have economic finality and protocols that don't. Whereas the public permissionless blockchains have their own economic finality, either through mining or proof of stake or whatever you want to call it. And stuff like Farcaster and so on either borrows economic finality from Ethereum or doesn't have it at all. And economic finality is not necessary, but it is sort of like, and I'm pushing this term economic finality because personal favorite term of mine, because I think it really captures why sort of with the actual innovation that Satoshi came up with Bitcoin, beyond just users who own their own private keys. And those were the two big innovations. One is you don't need DNS. You just can have your own keys. This is a possibility. I mean, it has upsides and downsides, but Satoshi was the first one to be like, we can just have people have their own private keys. And it works, at least somewhat. And then there's the economic finality. This post is more about people owning their own private keys. One thing I have been thinking about in terms of the social media sort of space that is self-certifying, and maybe blockchains can be involved in this. A lot of the issue comes down to moderation, and moderation is hard. And if I look at the history of Twitter, Facebook, and so on, most of these have big problems with Sybil attacks. You can generate lots of accounts, you can spam, you can generate thousands of bot accounts and, try to manipulate the whole conversation or so on. You can be Russia or whatever. And most people try to solve this through some sort of identity layer. Like, all right, you'll have to put in your real name, your ID or whatever. And I think that doesn't work on a very fundamental level, and that can't be made to work. The thing I've always wanted to try, and I think people have tried this somewhat, if you remember the ancient Web1 forum, Something Awful, what they did is they had a sign-up fee. It took $10 to create an account. And this was back in 2001, where, things were paying $10 for something on the web was a much bigger deal. I remember I particularly didn't join that forum because I was, too young to have $10 to spend on the web. But the idea that you can actually pay for a Sybil sort of directly, I think, is underexplored in these spaces. Now, and it went out there, you don't want everyone to have to pay. You don't want to have Twitter blue again. One thing I thought that would be very interesting is if people could share these identities. I call them badges. So you have you pay $10 for a badge, and you can share this badge with any number of people. But if any of those people get banned, the badge is banned, and therefore everyone sharing it is banned. So if you want to trust other people with your identity or with your badge to get in, and they start spewing crap, then you might have to deal with the consequences of that. So anyway, that's just an idea. I've droned on for long enough already. Moving down to Grigori, I guess.
I have two issues with this little essay. And one issue with the word control, and the other issue with the word content. There is, of course, a naive version of control, and it means that a piece of content belongs to a creator and the creator only, and that's it. Why is it naive? Because in reality, once a piece of content is published, and we know it for sure, it is no longer under your control. The audience can read it, it can misread it, it can consume it, it can build something on top of it. but it is no longer under your control. It's basically lives its own life. And sometimes people ask you permission to do something with your piece. Sometimes they don't ask you. But anyway, once it's out there, it's not under your control. So focusing on just the creator, and it is another term that I have a problem with, is a little bit naive too. It is always an interplay between what the author can do and what the audience can do. And maybe other stakeholders, like, for example, publishers, platforms, courts. So much more interesting, in my view, is not to focus too much on the creator, but on what can happen with a piece of content after it has been published. Finally, again, the future of Web3, in my view, will be decided not by what the creators can do, not so much on what creators can do, but what kind of behavior patterns people will accept. And these patterns were shaped by hundreds of years of newspaper consumption, basically, and decades of web surfing. So these patterns are very hard to change. And these changes are happening rather slowly. And I will pass it on to Jordan.
Thank you. Yeah, I just would say the one thing that really stands out to me here is I'm really interested in ways in which we can build technical systems that are fairly transparently and tightly scoped, in that these are the kinds of transformations and inputs that we'll accept. Here's what we're going to do with them. Here's how we're going to be able to demonstrate that. Here's how we're giving a certain amount of agency to the people that are providing that data in terms of what kind of inputs they have, how long they're holding it, what kind of outputs they get. I won't go any further into that right now unless we want to follow that. So I'll pass it to Meyer here.
Yeah, I think I'm missing something in this article, and I'll explain what I feel I'm missing. Web 1, the host generates and gives authority. Web 2, the user generates and gives authority. And Web 3, the user generates and the user gives authority. I'm trying to understand why I ever needed authority to create content. I could always create content. The question was, could I allow other people to see the content even if the host didn't want me to see it, didn't want them to see it? And I think the answer is, for example, hypothesis. Hypothesis is not a host of the article we're looking at. It's a third party, and it's providing the service of me generating the content and hypothesis serving that content, even though Medium might not want me to do it. So I'm not sure I understand what the problem is. And when I read the article, he talks about things that he thinks are missing. Social graphs, user profiles, I'll repeat it again, user profiles. Maybe it's because Web3 was only ever planned for economic independence and not for the basic problem of users not being tied down to a particular host. So it seems to me between Web 2 and Web 3, there's a lot of sub-stages that don't require something as powerful as blockchain, or even not something as powerful as a RSA pair. So that is something I don't understand about the article. And the second item that I don't understand is what he means by self-certifying protocol. Okay. And how that's connected to my past and ability to do discovery and so on. I seem to be missing something important here. Unless he means that it allows us to create, what's the word? User profiles, which I have control over in one centralized location as in that I can access them with one key. So I'm not sure if that's what I want, but it doesn't seem to be what he's selling. So I'm not completely following this article. And I will pass on to Nathan.
Okay. Just to speak really fast to, I think the question Mayor had. I think the reason that sort of self-certifying is important comes down to this question of identity and kind of preventing or trying to work around some of the Sybil attack issues. You can't necessarily prevent people from creating a lot of accounts, but what you can do is you can, to a certain extent, prevent impersonation. And you can know that particular content was created by a particular person. And that's useful both from a trust perspective, how much do I trust these things, but also from a moderation perspective. Do I not want to see these things, or do I want to somehow, move these things out of my sphere? So I think that's kind of the nut of this. It also helps us ensure that content hasn't been modified. HTTPS kind of, gets us there, but, there are perhaps better ways to encapsulate that within the content itself. My thought with reading this is it feels actually a little incomplete to me. I do like what Jay's doing here and trying to expand beyond just blockchains, and I think this framework of user-generated authority and self-certifying protocols is a good one. I do think you'd need to add the idea of permissionless protocols to this. A lot of what's in the self-certifying is necessary to have a permissionless protocol, but it's not sufficient to have a permissionless protocol. You can do all of this within a closed system. And I think one of the key things with a lot of, at least the discussion around Web3 has been, how do you make it so that people can't gatekeep this content? And then, the moderation questions then flow from this. Well, if you don't have a gatekeeper, how do you make sure that content that you don't want to see, that you don't want to be associated with, doesn't get associated with you, doesn't get into your stream? So I think the idea of permissionless protocols is an important part of wherever you're going to go. And otherwise, you just sort of have, corporate blockchain, or it's Git, but it's only on the corporate server or something like that. And it's not clear to me that that's actually a significantly better world. But I do think what Jay's talking about here is a really important generalization. And I don't want to do anything that kind of, says this is less important. I just think you need to also think about the permissionless aspect too, and that blockchains, I think that was also a core innovation there. So I think that's my main thought. So I will pass down to Venkat.
A couple of interesting strands of thought here. The first, I think, if I understood Mayor's question correctly, I don't see the article as incomplete, as I think people misunderstanding what you can do with just a pair of keys without like a central authority and a directory or some other kind of reference point for the key pair. So the way I can imagine the simplest toy way of using a key pair is I publish a first piece of content using the key pair that associates sort of the seed of an identity with that public key. So for example, maybe I'm a completely unknown writer or poet, and I produce like a first piece of writing, and that's signed with the key. And then I become known as the person who wrote essay X. And then I start writing more and more under the key pair, and it can be all over the web. It doesn't have to be any particular place. But basically, that starts forming a content graph that's linked together by the key pair, and none of it has to be anchored anywhere. So there's almost like a theory of relativity going on here, where the self-certification foundation is kind of like self-referential. Like all the content is sort of like certifying the authenticity of other content. Now, if you compare this with like somewhat similar seeming schemes, like notarizing a document today in like the regular traditional system, you go to a notary, in front of them you sign a document, and then the notary adds their signature and maybe a rubber stamp. That's a form of sort of like a witness attestation, I think. So that seems to be a missing piece here. Witness attestation is somewhere between centralized attestation and self-attestation. And I'm also thinking of like back in the day, I don't know if they still do this, when you had to fill out forms in India for official purposes, they would often ask for, I forget the word they used, a self-certified photograph, by which they meant you had to paste a photograph on the form in the right place and then sign across it. That was their sort of like low-tech, low-security way of ensuring that it was your photograph and your signature together, since it's unlikely we're faking both. But my point here is that to me seems like the atomic simplest philosophical essence of like just using a key pair, which is making a content graph that's self-referentially self-attesting. But beyond that, you can't say anything else. Like you can't say that this entire body of work is created by Shakespeare or whatever. It's by whoever signed the first few documents establishing that content tree is the one associated with the rest. That's how I understand this. As for the relationship with the blockchain specific world, it's interesting that Jay came up with the formula hosted web, posted web, signed web, because I think it's actually a response to a similar formula. Who came? I think Chris Dixon came up with read-only web, read-write web, and read-write-own web. So ownership became the key there. And I think in response to that, in a Twitter discussion, a friend and I were chatting, and we came up with basically the Unix permission scheme of it goes from read to rewrite to read-write execute. Because really, the essence of Web3, what agency you get with signing authority with key pairs is the ability to run code in random places. So long as you have the right pair of keys, and there's like contracts published on the blockchain or other random places, you can use the key pair to execute the code. So it becomes a read, write, execute web. So the question is, which of these three notions is actually fundamental to what's going on here? Is it execution? Is it ownership? Or is it the ability to sign things? To me, it seems like signing authority is almost the weakest notion because it applies to like the simplest technical situations. Ownership is obviously the most powerful notion, and it's not yet clear that things like NFTs actually prove that ownership makes sense in the real world. But there's like a little psychological wrinkle here, which I think gets ignored, which is ownership is a very powerful historical cultural pattern, much more so than signing. So equivalents of signing have always existed, right? Like imperial seals, actual physical locks and keys for locking up, like the city gates or like treasure chests and things like that. So keys have existed, but ownership, I think, is like a deeply powerful sort of concept, and it exists on an independent basis. It's not an instrumental thing where we only have ownership because we want to be able to do certain things socially. That's not the case. We have ownership because it's like central to our identities. It's ownership is an extension of identity in some sense. And one piece of evidence, I think I mentioned this on a couple of weeks ago call, is I think you could say that on the blockchain side of Web3, you could say social tokens have basically failed, but NFTs kind of succeeded for the same purpose. So social tokens is basically like offering shares of yourself and your future revenue, like income share agreements. It's a little bit like, digital fractional slavery of some sort. But NFTs make objects ownable as opposed to people, and they succeeded much more. And I think that's revealing. And the way I interpret what's going on right now is there's a spectrum from like public goods where nobody owns it, nobody needs to sign to use it, nobody. So there's no ownership. Everybody has execution authority, and signatures are irrelevant. So that's public goods. You don't need to prove who you are to go enjoy a walk in the public park, right? So that's one stable end of the spectrum. So public goods are stable. The other extreme is owned private goods are stable, and that's blockchain. Public goods are done by both the open source world, and versions of blockchain do like a better version of public goods, I think. But what Jay is trying to do, I think, falls in the middle, and I'm not sure it's a stable or useful place yet. I think I'm willing to be convinced based on like the initial experience of Blue Sky. I think groups that are like less individualist, have more of like a hive mind sociology going on, they can find a lot of benefit from like signature-based interactions that are neither ownership nor public goods, somewhere in the middle. So like think of it as like not private or public, but it's like socially, culturally owned goods. Like, a music community that is the fan of a particular genre of music, they kind of own the music that their internal musicians produce. Forget copyright and stuff, but sort of in a psychological, moral ownership sense, maybe the hip hop fan community owns hip hop culture, something like that. That's where notions like appropriation come from, which is the community that has invested the most in a cultural tradition kind of has some rights over it, and if somebody else tries to like expropriate those rights, conflict is set up. So I would say Jay's infrastructure kind of maps to the subculture level, and you can see that by the kinds of subcultures that have joined in. And also I'm sort of intrigued by the fact that the way I understand key pairs at the lowest level, it looks like social proof to me, and social proof is the foundation of like how subcultures cohere. It's not material mathematical proof, nor is it like tautologies or public utility type things. So anyway, sorry to go on too long, so let me stop here. And I think Anant is next, and I'm not sure if Anurag is speaking, but Jenna also is on in the next round. So Anant.
Thank you. Yeah, I thought the article was nice, and it sort of my understanding of the article was that it's trying to sort of define the evolution of the web, and sort of to make that definition, the article tries to sort of separate the evolution of the web from the sort of advancements in blockchains, and makes an argument for self-certifying protocols, which I sort of I find myself aligning with, in that blockchains, or sort of this distributed consensus or distributed execution mechanisms, are just one of the primitives of the next sort of evolution of the web. But I think it was Gregory that was talking about the sort of the evolution of the web in terms of the user experience, in terms of what the users have come to expect, and that's it seems like an article written from the engineering perspective, as opposed to from the user perspective, specifically in terms of the implications for the users, right? Like for I'm forgetting an example that I had in mind, but anyway, so I also liked the point that Venkat, you were making about the read write and read write own versus like read write and versus read write and execute. The execution seems to be like an important part of this evolution, like a distributed execution that nobody owns and it's permissionlessly run, and it sort of fits into this definition of. And in terms of looking at needs, it sort of fits into the definition that I think one of the professors, Dan Bonnet, he said that blockchain provides a coordination between many parties when there is no single trusted party, and it basically says that, and then goes on to say that if trusted party exists, there is no need for blockchain. So it seems like the applications that don't need trusted parties are like the sort of first applications of blockchain, which happens to be money and money-related applications, which the article also seemed to be less excited about, and was looking at other applications, and ergo the sort of self-certifying protocols and all the different primitives that go along with it. One thing that did strike me while reading this, and just reading all these different protocols that are getting built outside of just the core, the blockchain protocols, is that the emphasis on social graphs and the ownership of data seems to be on the social graph. And it seems to occurs to me that the Web2 world, the ownership was largely these social graphs that people tend to form and have, and this seems like the next evolution seems to be not really evolving as opposed to like a residual effect of that social graph, and trying to retrofit it with new advances in cryptographic primitives, which it seems useful, but again, I'm not convinced that that's the sort of way forward for looking at applications outside of just sort of money applications in blockchain. And again, I'm not sure how much of this evolution can be built without like advances in blockchains. Like there are serious bottlenecks in the execution layer of the sort of modern blockchains, and there are other approaches like layer 2 and new blockchains that are getting developed to sort of eliminate that bottleneck. But without the execution layer, it doesn't seem like to me that like a concrete read, write, own, or read, write, execute web can be built. But anyway, I'll stop there, just rambling on. I'll pass on to Anuraj.
Yeah, so after reading the article, like I was not convinced if the definition of Web3 is self-certifying protocols, because like here there is an example of Git, and basically these days most people use Git with a server, but you don't actually need a server for Git. So I have used it in ways without a server. So but Git didn't feel like Web3 innovation. So it seems like blockchain is more fundamental to it. And basically, like I tried to find a definition for it, but I couldn't figure it out. But it seems like blockchains plus social graph and the social activities that blockchains enable, it's more what I feel is Web3. Yeah, those were some initial thoughts. Is it Jenna next?
Answer. And I posted screenshots because the links don't embed yet. You'll see them in the channel. And two things. One is I would have asked the same question that Anil did in his second post, which is it feels like a consumer grade app that you onboard. It's really easy. But I too was vague about, so well, where is the blockchain in Blue Sky? And Jay's response was really quick and really clear. You see it there. She said, there is no blockchain. It's Merkle trees, which now, because of thanks to Nathan, I sort of know what that is. But part of what happened then is I'm constantly impressed by how much Jay replies and keeps the tone really pleasant. And then in the replies, there is now a classic sort of reply guy dude being mean to Anil. And I think it's the first time I've seen meanness on Blue Sky. So the stuff that have come up today around moderation and how do you handle it? I know that the Blue Sky team's really working on that, and that it feels like nobody has answers, but everybody's got stuff they can try. and that it's appreciate being there watching, like this is a new dawn in the turn of this screw we've all been working on for a couple of decades now. I'll pass it back to the group.
Wanted to chime in a little bit on like blue sky culture and contrast it with Farcaster culture. I have experienced quite a bit of rudeness on blue sky already. I think partly because a big subculture I used to be part of on Twitter suddenly onboarded and brought all its baggage and conflicts with it. So suddenly I found that I went from like a new kid in a new school where nobody knew me to somebody all the people knew again and had the same responses too. But even factoring that out, that there was a particular cause in this case, I think in general, Blue Sky already has like more tensions and sort of acrimony going on than Farcaster has, even though it's more than a year old. And I'm thinking, as I talk, I'm getting more convinced of my thesis that Blue Sky is basically for communities and subcultures, whereas Farcaster has more individualist, classic crypto libertarian culture. Because I remember a cast from Vitalik several weeks back saying, is Farcaster possibly too nice? And that struck me as interesting because Vitalik is, of course, hater magnet and gets lots of trolling activity on Twitter as the founder of Ethereum. And this is an Ethereum-centric community. And if he's having a particularly nice experience on Farcaster, that kind of is like, to me, proof that Farcaster is fundamentally nice. And that fits my experience as well. Nobody has been rude to me on Farcaster for a much longer time. And I'm trying to think why that is. So Blue Sky being for subcultures is one reason. But the other thought I had was there was this old line, I don't know how true it is, but about the Wild West in the US where the idea was because everybody carried guns, everybody was extremely polite. Because in a culture where everybody carries guns and like starts a duel with you at the drop of a hat, you are careful not to cause offense or take offense too easily because it gets deadly really quickly. And I think to a limited extent, Farcaster reflects that, but also I think it's just generally conflict-averse people who don't like brawling. Whereas Blue Sky, the very fact that it's brought on like slightly tribalized subcultures, partly by design and partly by sort of accident, they've kind of brought on less conflict-averse cultures. And to me, this again, sort of like at a technical level, this tells me that this is a technical space for ownership patterns that belong at the subcultural level rather than the public level or individual level. Yeah. Any more thoughts? So if anybody needs invites to either Blue Sky or Farcaster to check either or both out, I have invites to both, so just let me know.
I would like to understand a little bit more about the connection between the protocol and the level of politeness. I mean, that people are scared of each other because they can shoot each other by mistake. That I understand. But I don't think it's just one-dimensional. Are there any other factors which modify it?
Ownership is definitely one. Like, I think a lot of people on the communal or public sort of end of the spectrum, so I'm like making a spectrum up here, they think of ownership as an instrumental thing. You have certain like allocation problems to be solved. You have people's needs and wants that need to be met for them to live a good life. And they think ownership is just like an instrumental technology that allows for one class of solutions. If you let people own things, people will get what they need, blah, blah, blah. But I think there is actually a fundamental cultural thing too. There are people who believe in ownership as almost like a religious idea. And I think that's there too. So I think the blockchain is built of people who think ownership is fundamental, and Blue Sky and what I'm now thinking of as like everything should be public utilities, almost communist end of the web. they think ownership should be instrumental. So that's another variable. So there's probably others as well. I think another one is just mutualism. Like, how much can you be a complete person by yourself versus you need to be entangled with other people?
And maybe it's like two different things. One is the people who are initially populating the protocol are people that have a certain mindset, and the second one is what's going to happen in another 5 years. So some protocols have a built-in support for being viral, and other protocols have a built-in support for those that fight more, get more attention. And I can understand that. I'm trying to understand if Forecast versus Blue Sky, as the way the protocol is defined, forget about the fact that one of them is populated by people who believe that ownership is important. Do these protocols actually change in the long term where people might get to? What type of behaviors is encouraged by the system? Loud behavior, obnoxious behavior, deep behavior, and so on. That's what I'm trying to connect, and I'm not managing yet.
I think that is true to the extent the architects design the features in. So, for example, if ownership is a value, but you also make it like technically possible for ownership to be a thing, which is possible on blockchain versions, then yeah, that'll sort of cement over the long term. Another one that just played out is quote tweeting. So a lot of people have very strong opinions on quote tweeting on Twitter because it's used as a mechanism for like dunking, basically. So people with lots of followers dunking on people with few followers. So a lot of people think it's a bad pattern. And Farcaster resisted it for the longest time. Blue Sky launched with quote tweeting in place, and Farcaster, I think, has reluctantly decided it needs it too. So it's building it into the protocol, but not yet into the reference app. So Whatcast doesn't have quote tweeting properly yet, but the protocol already does. So yeah, I think short term turning into long term is like a medium message design evolution coupling kind of thing.
So are there any papers that talk about how these small number of features give you more different types of politeness? Not different types of pathological behavior, but different types of politeness.
But with Farcaster, wouldn't it be possible when the hubs are live to create your own kind of politeness factor into the feed itself? Like one hub could have more politeness than the other hub if there are enough people on the network.
That should be possible, yeah. Go ahead, Wilson.
I was just going to say, I think this was where I was thinking with the permissionless aspect being important, and it not just being about content addressing and self-certification. Because if you have that sort of permissionless backend, then you can do exactly what you're talking about, Anuraj. You can have different servers with different standards and different clients with different standards, and to a certain extent, people can kind of choose their own moderation. This is sort of orthogonal, but I was actually thinking this morning, because I've been watching some of the people debate on Substack Notes about the place of moderation, and it seems like I feel like there's going to be a real divide, and this is another sort of interesting divide about whether moderation needs to be centralized and you need to have a central place of trust, or moderation can be sort of more siloed. It feels Farcaster is definitely, I think, in the siloed side. I'm not really sure where Blue Sky is. It feels like it leans more in that direction too, but I think that that's going to depend upon what those moderation features look like. But it seems like Jay wants to go in the more siloed moderation direction as well. Siloed, yes. I'd be curious if there's I think there's a whole interesting thing about like how much central control you want, but that's like way off topic. So
I think a good open question that for all these questions that are coming up is, does the medium is the message concept apply to protocols or only to the apps on top? Because I would argue that Mastodon proves that the protocol has a message as well. So I don't think it's an accident that Mastodon has turned into this federation of like extremely progressive servers that sort of choose to like defederate each other upon suspicions of there being Nazis in the mix or something like that. And all of them have strong terms of service as a signaling mechanism. So I think permissionless will get part of the way in allowing a multiple, like pluralist cultures to thrive. But it's, I don't think protocols are like unopinionated technological layers. They will have their own sort of medium as the message opinion. So it's not clear to me how that plays out yet.
Yeah, well, definitely different, depending upon the protocol design, different styles of moderation become easier or harder. So I think that just kind of plays into a little bit. I think that goes exactly what you're saying, Venkat. And that also kind of suggests that interplay with the communities is that, you know, different communities are going to demand different moderation styles, then different protocols come to better or worse support different moderation styles. You know, and maybe you can do it everything with everything, but it always becomes a question of, you know, what's harder to do. I can hammer a screw in, but it works better with a screwdriver, etc.
All right, we're almost on the hour. And by the way, are people interested in a second session on the GPT-4 Sparks of General Intelligence paper that we led, I think, at this point about 3 weeks back? And there was some interest, but I was not sure how much there is. So I'll post a comment on that. If there's interest, we'll do another session on that paper. So vote thumbs up or thumbs down on when I post that. And I think that's it. So we are still in this AI plus memory side of distributed systems, but we are, I think, starting to now connect the dots with these older themes of crypto and general distributed systems. So yeah, interesting times. So if you find any good readings that start to connect the dots of these different portions of the map, please share them in distributed systems so we can build up more readings, because we have like 100 readings in the list, but I think most of them are not that interesting. So we need to build up more readings again. All right, see you guys next